This is Business Decoded podcast with Ronnie Spellman. An informal chats with top business moguls as they share their stories of failure and success in a fun and relaxed way. Get entertained, educated, and unlock the secrets to success.
Welcome to Business Decoded with Ronnie Spellman. I'm here with another wonderful friend on the program, Stan Crow. Stan, welcome.
Thank you, Ronnie. Great to be here.
It's good to have you. Now, Stan has had a great career in the military, and most recently, he was the former chief executive for Northrop Grumman, Japan, and he is the space and defense technology industry expert, and you deal with a lot of global businesses, but your background is absolutely amazing. I worked early in my career at NASA, and just to look at what you've done is just amazing. I've looked at some of your work and your publications and how you've structured the opportunities in space, and I know we'll get there, Stan, but welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, I understand you grew up in Idaho.
I did.
Okay, what was it like?
Well, it's great. And I'd actually say, I think that one of the things that we often talk about is sort of where is Idaho? Because people often confuse us with Iowa or something else, or and my wife have a running debate about, do we consider ourselves Pacific or just Northwest or just a mountain state? And it's a little bit of all of those. But growing up there was fantastic. We were right on the edge of the town of Boise, which had, being a capital city, all of the sort of cultural things one would expect with that and government. But it was small enough that I could just sort of turn out my backyard, and I was into undeveloped areas. So I had the hillsides to go walk through and trek around and build forts and do the things that are fantastic as a young boy growing up.
Were you a big fort builder?
I was.
My daughter was into box forts.
Okay.
And so one day she listened to this young man from Canada who built box forts, and she was so excited. She was really little. So I gathered as many boxes as I could from the local grocery store, this massive amount. I probably had 100 plus boxes. And with all the neighborhood kids, we built this huge, massive box fort with tunnels and doors and rooms. And it was an incredible experience for them. We only used the boxes, and then we used duct tape. And we crafted this amazing design. So those are the wonderful items in life that you don't realize have a great impact on who we become later on.
Well, it's all about imagination.
It is.
And how we find ways to kind of bring that imagination to life in some way with what we have around.
Now, do you think growing up in Idaho is what inspired you to consider the space realm, just because you could see so much? In the cities, you can't see much of space because of the light that's kind of obstructing that view.
Well, Ronnie, that's a great question. I think, certainly we could see the stars. Right. And I took an astronomy class early on and started to learn the names of the stars and things like that. But even before that, I think it was part of an era. And I don't know that it mattered so much where we were. I actually remember the Apollo 11 landing, watching that on television. So, that's how old I am. But it was inspiring, and it was the kind of thing that I think made us immediately aware, as I remember many of my friends and I talking about the world, that there were things that were out there that were beyond our immediate location. Right. And so, we knew our local neighborhood, but we also had this sense that there's other big things happening. And that was great, both in nature, kind of the geometry and the geography of what's going on, but then also activities that are inspiring.
That race to space back in the John Kennedy era really inspired a lot of people, a lot of Americans, to attach to something that seems so far grander, as you just mentioned, than our own selves. And so it seemed like it inspired a lot of people.
It did.
Yeah.
And still does.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. So we'll get to some of that later, because there's been a lot of movement now in that space industry with privatized space flight. And recently we had someone to essentially walk in space on a private craft from a private craft. So there's so much happening, which I think people will be intrigued by. But before that, how do you go from Idaho to the U.S. Air Force? Like, how did you figure out that that's an option? Interestingly enough, I won't say most, a lot of people don't recognize that there are these academies in the U.S. that are completely free, top-of-the-line education, great programs. How did you figure that out?
Yeah, great question. I credit my parents. So a couple of steps there. First of all, It's the story of Buck Rogers that sort of gave me this idea that there's a career path, knowing that I wanted to be an astronaut, which I sort of decided upon watching the Apollo moon landings. And by the way, I still haven't become an astronaut, although I'll say yet, not given the trends you were just talking about. And the Air Force pilot was one way to go do that, right?
Very true.
And so I had this in my head, and then my parents had taken a trip through Colorado Springs and came back and told me about the Air Force Academy. Okay. And so in 6th grade, that was the place that I said, well, that makes sense. Why don't I just go there?
Interesting.
And that was the only school I applied to.
What were they doing on that trip? I presume they were not headed to the academy for anything.
I don't actually remember, when I was in 6th grade, what exactly my parents were out doing, but they may have been driving to see my father's parents who lived in Nebraska, so they may have been out.
That's amazing.
On one of the commutes out that way.
That's amazing. They're just driving through and they see this huge campus and came back and gave you that vision.
They knew of my interest in space and in flight, and so for them they could connect the dots and got me the T-shirt. Right. And it was my favorite T-shirt then to wear for many years.
Do you still have it by any chance?
I do not. I do not. No, it wouldn't. That one wouldn't fit anymore.
I have a few of those old ones. I don't wear them, but I was in a couple of different programs, American Legion program for Boys State, and I still have the shirt that I wore in Boys State because it had such an impact on my existence. So I can imagine how that may have impacted you. Did you have a telescope? And
I did.
Did you?
Yeah, binoculars, small telescope, and then got a larger one.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, there's been so much. In fact, I sent you an article the other day about some of what's happening in space. And the idea of trying to look beyond our galaxy and look as far out in space as we can, and just the technology to do so is pretty amazing. So Air Force Academy, you're there, you're studying aeronautical engineer. Then what was the game plan? Tell us more about that journey. I'd love to have more young people acknowledge and recognize the opportunity of being able to go to the academy.
Well, and I think that's so important. And whether it's a service academy or any other number of other great educational institutions, but seeing what those opportunities are. And I would also say too that look at community colleges as well.
Sure.
Because those are a great foundation to begin to build, and then get subsequent steps from there. But in my case, I came in wanting to be an astronaut, as I'd said, and wanted to do things in space. So I majored early in as astronautical engineering, and there were only 2 places at the time in the country one could do that at the undergraduate level, and the Air Force Academy was one. And so that gave a great foundation, and that was what led to my opportunity to intern at NASA.
Oh, okay.
And so I did that as an Air Force cadet.
Really? Which NASA facility?
It was in Cleveland.
Okay.
It was what was then called the Lewis Center, and now the Glenn Center. And an opportunity to write computer codes and talk about how satellites would maneuver in space and some different things that were very fun. And then had sort of a detour. Now, this was the first time that sort of the reality of a world that sometimes does what we want and sometimes has its own constraints started to appear to me. And that was that my eyes didn't cooperate with what the requirements were for taking a pilot slot.
Okay.
And so I started to look at engineering and then look at some different opportunities. And I actually then switched over into what became a sort of a corollary passion. I mentioned global activities, but international work. And so I said, if I wanted to sort of learn more about the rest of the world here on Earth for a while, then I could do that through an intelligence path. And so spent some time in the security world, picked up some languages, and then got a chance to go do some of that and spend some time in Asia. Wow. And then eventually come back to bring that into the engineering, but now with a perspective of how do you collaborate with other global partners to do that too. So it's not just a U.S. thing anymore.
So let's come back to that in a second. On the Air Force Academy piece, you get there. So real quick, how did you figure out how to get your sponsorship and go through that process? Because you can get a presidential sponsorship or you can get your senator or U.S. House member. How did you navigate from 6th grade that you learned about it to mapping the course of knowing where to go to find the right sponsor and then go through. There's a huge interview process, like going to any Ivy League school.
That's right. That's right.
Well,
we did what, today would start with a search on the internet. And back in that day, it was the card catalog in the library. And I checked out a book on the Air Force Academy. I love it. And it outlined the steps. And
the young people today, they don't know what a Dewey Decimal System is.
That's right. It was kind of a search algorithm of its day, kind of, so to speak. But the book, and it outlined the steps, and then the high school counselor was there to help advise me, and then there were just a series of steps that went along with that.
I was thinking this the other day. I'm not sure that people recognize how valuable their school counselor can be.
Yes.
And just giving us insight and information. Our parents are great, but they don't know completely everything. As a parent, I don't know everything. But that counselor, same thing with me, that counselor played an incredible role with me figuring out some of the options available.
That's exactly right. I mean, it had to be a dialogue, so I had to bring into it some parameters or some direction on what I thought might be of interest. But then the counselor was able to help further test that and then also show some of the mechanisms to go forward.
Right.
So they had a diagnostic to take an interest questionnaire and see what else you might be interested in besides the things you're thinking of. And then here's some of the steps to take along those paths.
Sure. So were you interested in the military or just the Air Force so that you can get to the space program at that time?
So like many things, there's one facet that appeared to me and appealed initially, which was that kind of what I thought was pretty much a straight line to space and turned out to be anything but straight.
Sure.
But in the course of that detour, like many journeys, I learned more and started to appreciate other aspects. So it wasn't, I would say, national defense or security or patriotism or any of those things per se that had also attracted me about going there. But in the course of spending time in that world and understanding more about it, I gained much more appreciation for all of those. And so
that's pretty amazing.
It's kind of like later, our boys did Boy Scouts and kind of watching that growth. It starts off with maybe it's the camping.
Right.
But then you see the citizenship and the other elements, the leadership that come through. And it was only after some hindsight, I was probably the least interested in this idea of leadership.
Sure.
As a kid. But later that then became one of the, I think, strongest takeaways that I gained from that, to be able to see what that feels like from a follower perspective, from a peer perspective, and a leader perspective. How do those leadership skills grow? Completely unexpected benefit of that time.
And Stan, and I appreciate you letting me ask you a little about that as well, because I've had a couple of other debates with people, and they'll ask, well, why do you take a sixth grader or someone even younger and expose them to some of these items? But you never know what will resonate. And then a lot of times you expose them to something, and over time, as they mature and grow, they think back to those earlier days, and then it creates this amount of energy and optimism and inspiration that you didn't realize, but that young person connects the dots on their own time. And you can't give up on exposing people to those options. And so I think that's really intriguing how you evolved.
I agree, and I think it's we've talked before about this idea about sort of my metaphor of the dance.
Right.
I think there's a dance we do with life, where there's a part that we have internally and there's a part that's external to us. And that external reality that shapes us and is a foil by which we grow, learn more about ourselves, and then understand what it means to, which kind of bring it to a business sense, how do we actually create value in that? That requires that back and forth.
Right.
We don't just make this up internally and then go force our view of the world on it, and it's not just clay that we mold. There's a bit of ability to help form things, but it's also a lot about learning what else is there.
It is. I often think back. I grew up in a military community. I grew up in Virginia, near Langley Air Force Base.
Yes.
So a lot of my friends were in the military, and I think back on it now that I am older. And I often wonder if the military would have been a great option for me, because I've seen so many people enter the military, whether it's officers after college or enlisted, they give a 20 plus or so year career, and they're still young enough to transition. And so we'll get to your career, but they're young enough to transition into the private sector. And so people can get to that private business enterprise if that's where they want to go at one point, and still yet have a productive, successful career in the military, which also exposes them to so much around the world, depending on the path they take. And you've had that. You've had careers in both public and private now, in the military and in the business sector. But walk us through a little of your journey, because you've operated, you spent how long in the military?
29 years altogether.
That is incredible.
13 of that was active duty, and then 16 reserve. So that kind of overlapped then the private career that I've had since then.
That is amazing. And so you spend that time in the military. You travel the world, presumably while in the military. You manage big operations, presumably in the Air Force. Want to tell us a little bit, whatever you can, if there's anything confidential?
Well, sure. I mean, it was, I think, a couple of the themes. We mentioned one around space, and that would come up from time to time. And I had tours in, for example, what's now LA Space Force Base, which is looking at the future requirements and the systems for space capabilities.
Sure.
But prior to that, I spent my time in what was primarily a counterintelligence capability with an organization called the Office of Special Investigations, because, as I mentioned, I wanted to learn languages.
Right.
And I hadn't done that. I hadn't had really an interest in foreign languages until fairly late. And this was one way to go do that.
Okay. Interesting.
So I spent some time early in my military career learning Korean language.
Okay.
And then from there.
Why Korean?
Well, again, a funny thing about that dance with life, right?
Right.
I actually aimed for Greek.
Okay.
And then in the partnership with the Air Force, you sort of say what you'd like to do, and then they come back and say what you get to do. And there's a process of taking language aptitude tests, and then in the way that came out, I'd scored in the level for the Asian languages.
Okay, interesting.
And so Korean was available. We had a lot of activities going on there, and it turned out to be a fantastic opportunity for me. So I ended up with 3 tours there. Met a lot of great people, learned a lot. At one point, my wife came over with me, and our oldest son was born there. So just tremendous.
Now, I learned from your friend not long ago, Jim Keys, that he defined the acronym CEO, Chief Executive Officer. He defined it as change equals opportunity. And I thought, that's really fascinating. It sounds like with your goal being Greek, but yet you go through this process and they designate Korean for you. You probably were initially thinking, why? But then it turns out to be a great opportunity. So that change in your life probably led to so many other opportunities for you, not by design, but either by force or accident.
Yes, although I would say that I'd bring in a little personal philosophy and say that I do, as a man of faith, I do believe there is actually ultimate design. It may not be my intrinsic design where I know where it's going, but I believe we definitely are all participating in a grander design that is there for our ultimate good. And so that's why I think that change and opportunity, that the fundamental sense that there's hope. And that change is not to be feared if we approach it in the right way. I fully would agree with what Jim said for that reason.
Amazing. So, Stan, I'd love to walk me through your career. So, 20 plus years in the military, and then you leave. Well, and then you do what? You worked at Northrop Grumman in quite a few places. So, walk us through that.
Actually, the key pivot there in between was I had about 5 years with McKinsey. Okay. And that was
consulting group.
That's right. That was the transition between the piece around technology and global experience that I got through the Air Force, but then bringing in the business context.
Okay.
So was really blessed with the opportunity as I left active duty to go work with the McKinsey team in both Los Angeles and later in London. And that's basically another sort of boot camp, if you will, in this case a business boot camp. Right. With a lot of training and on the job experience in a wide range of industries, semiconductors, automotive, media, all different things. But then eventually, as I was looking for my niche, it turned out that aerospace and defense was really still that niche. And so gravitated back to that. And it was upon learning that this was really where I was best able to add value.
Sure.
Back to my point before about, really it's a self-learning and it's kind of dialogue with the world. What can I do that matters, that resonates? And as that became clear, then it made sense to say, well, I want to do this full time, so I should be a part of something where I can be on the creative building side of that. And that brought me back to Northrop Grumman.
So that's fascinating. And I don't know if this was the case with you, but I've seen so many people that, let's say they grow up with a parent working in a specific industry, let's say construction as an example. And then they go to college, they start their career not in that industry, and they think they're going to escape it. Like they want to run away from whatever the family business because it's something that they're very familiar with and they just want to do something different. And ultimately what they figure out is that's where their knowledge base is, that's where their comfort base is, and they end up returning to that specific industry. When you got out, was your goal to get away from space at that point, just to explore or just to try something different? And then ultimately it sounds like you ended up back in that industry that you'd spent so much of your career and life around.
That's right. Well, I think it's we're all potentially victims of the grass is greener philosophy, right? And,
absolutely.
And, if we don't know. And so testing those boundaries, testing the hypothesis, or in a philosophical or a religious sense, I'd say, discernment of how do we know that this is the right thing for me? Right. You need to go examine that and try to be as objective as possible. And that can take a lot of forms. Having mentors, counselors, opportunities to go do something different.
Right.
And, if it's the right thing, you'll come back to it. Right. And you'll come back to it with a position of confidence and knowledge that this isn't just something that I happen to have an opinion about, but I've tested it in some way that I can. And so now I can say this is something I can more confidently focus on, and I'll be better at it because I won't be doubting later on. Is this the right thing?
And I agree with you. Sometimes it can sharpen our understanding, and also it creates a level of appreciation for what we know. Mm-hmm. Because we've gone out and we've tested the other, as you said, the other grass, the other side of the fence. And we learned that we're actually pretty good at what we previously did. And we're quite knowledgeable in it. So you moved to Northrop Grumman. You became their, Chief Technology Officer and VP of Technology, if I remember correctly? Or?
So my last role, that's right, for the defense system sector, then I had the technology and those operational portfolios, and that was kind of bringing together a number of the operational activities and the technology activity, and a lot of the organizational insights as well. There's also a piece to it that relates a lot to our conversation about sort of development, because talent is an inevitable and critical part of a successful organization. Sure. So how do we bring in that, and in my case, technical talent, and be able to give them the experiences and the mentorship to grow in the organization was as critical as thinking about how do we go develop a next engineering design about something or some particular technology set of intellectual property. But the people aspect is so important.
Now, how do you drive all those technologists from a people perspective? Because that can be interesting. I've worked at a couple of different technology companies, worked with a lot of engineers. Engineers can be an interesting group from a people and motivation standpoint, but also a fun group. I mentioned this, I think, in another program. At one point, we were testing this new composite material at NASA, in fact. And when we thought that this product would fail, they had a weight on it that would incrementally put pressure on it, and we wanted to see when it would fail, at what point it would fail. Mm-hmm. And when we thought it would fail, and failure wasn't this huge explosion. You probably know this. Everyone, that I tell the story to, they think there's this huge explosion. There's not. It's probably hairline crack. But it was an exciting day for all of us that were in engineering. Most people might not consider that exciting. But how do you build a culture and a people focus that inspires these technologists? One of the issues we ran into with a lot of our engineers is that they did a lot of great work, but they weren't marketers. So they didn't really promote what they developed or created. And what was important for our leadership team was to try to sell the work that they're doing to other people that might not understand it from a technical standpoint. So I'd love to hear your insight on people and engineers and how you create a culture.
My short answer to this is storytelling.
Okay.
And then I'll expand on that because there's a couple of aspects of it. And I think what's so important is always reminding and helping people to understand the why of what they're doing. and people are attracted to engineering because they already sort of see that.
Right.
They like the idea of building something. They like the idea of building box forts.
Right.
Whatever it is. Something, if I want to go make something. And this impulse to build, I think, again, this is intrinsic to us. I do, believe our place in the universe is to be co-creators, right?
Sure.
We take the raw material that's here and we help to improve it, right? So there's something very fundamental about that. But somewhere along the way, and I've seen a lot of surveys, and I've looked at the STEM education pipeline. If you ask young kids in kindergarten or through elementary school who wants to be an engineer or a scientist or a mathematician, and all 80% of the hands will tend to go up. And then somewhere around 8th grade, fewer hands start to go up.
Interesting.
And then as you go further along, fewer and fewer. And that's because a lot of reasons. Part of it's healthy, that people are learning there are other things to do, and they go find a better fit. But partly it's also because engineering, there are some things about it that can be difficult, and sometimes people the patience to continue through and develop those sometimes more difficult skills that make an engineer able to be actually effective can take some time. And seeing where all the pieces fit in can also start to be difficult. So there's a great story that we heard during the Apollo program where the astronauts would go and meet the engineers who were working on the space program and say, I'm going to be flying in this thing.
Right.
And so those engineers, try to really make it personal that they needed to do everything they could to make these spacecraft successful because of the very human lives of the people they had now just met. By extension, in Northrop Grumman, we would often bring in military personnel who would be using who had been, in many cases, their lives had been saved by the correct functioning of the systems that had been built by the company. And that really, at a line engineering level, for people who, engineers, particularly younger ones, who may not get out and go see the ultimate customers of what they're, or beneficiaries of what they're doing, that's another way to sort of tell the why.
Right.
There are many other examples of that, about why work can be important, but I think just continuing to reinforce that is one of the key elements to keep that motivation.
Well, and that's intriguing, because if you look at an automobile today, there's a lot of technology in cars that didn't exist some years ago. It's just the technology expansion in vehicle is incredible. And an airplane, oh my gosh, that technology is just immense. And so you're probably firsthand seeing so much of that technology, from fly-by-wire to a lot of development since then on safety and performance at Northrop Grumman. I don't know if you can speak to some of that, but the technology use is just incredible.
It is, Ronnie, and I think there's a lot of areas, in some areas I'm working in now, for example, artificial intelligence. There's a lot of discussion around that, and it's there's so much potential there. And then other things that maybe don't have as much sort of headline press, but what are we doing in basic fasteners and connector kinds of systems that help things come together? How are we improving our production techniques to make things more flexible and more affordable? So many of these different kinds of technologies, whether they're catching the headline news every day or whether they're a little less visible, are helping us to be so much more capable. The opportunities to do things that are better and are more affordable and are going to continue to help make our lives more exciting. It's boundless.
I love it. So we're nearing the end of this one. The next program, I want to talk more about your effort in space. I read some recent documents that spoke about the different waves and the evolution of privatized space. But before we wrap this segment up, tell me about how you got to Japan with Northrop Grumman. You were the chief executive officer for Northrop Grumman Japan. How did that occur, and what were you responsible for?
So this was I shared the story of the Korean language study with the Air Force, and then from there, I had an opportunity to continue working in that region with other languages, and ended up studying Japanese and studying Japanese history. And my master's degree is actually in Japan studies.
Very cool.
From the Air Force, with a technical element to it. And so that continued to be an interest. And then it was several years later then when I had spent some time with Northrop Grumman that their expansion of their global business came up. I got to be part of that team early on, and led a number of our international efforts. And then it worked out for me to take that role, leading that office as it was standing up. And so I spent about 5 years there altogether. Just fantastic.
So you helped to build out that entire operation?
That's correct.
That is amazing. So tell us what that's like from an entrepreneurial standpoint, because Northrop Grumman, I was just talking to someone about creating a business within a business. And it sounds like that's what you did. So Northrop Grumman here in the U.S., big company, big operation, but you're starting from the ground up in a totally different country on a product that could be security sensitive as well in a foreign country. Walk us through what that looked like and what you built and how you built it without giving us any sensitive information.
Sure, of course. Yeah, I mean, first of all, nothing's coming completely without any antecedent, right?
Sure.
So the relationship of some of the Northrop Grumman heritage companies in Japan started back in the 1920s.
Okay.
And so there had been long relationships, and interestingly, even before and then after World War II, picking right back up. So yes, there was a lot of background there actually. Okay. So the first step, anything when you walk into something, is see what's already here.
Right.
And there was some substantial relationship and even business foundation. What we were doing is ramping that up.
Okay.
And so then it was a question about what are we trying to do and what resources does that take and how does that fit the moment? Mm-hmm. And so then as we looked at that and some of the major projects that are underway, Japan itself has been undergoing a tremendous transformation in their view of themselves in the world, geopolitically. Sure. And by correlation, what that means for their defense and space needs, and therefore how they're relating to the United States and then U.S. companies. So I was able to bring all of that really to bear into helping to formulate the strategy. Okay. And then it was a close cooperation with our company's CEO and leadership team globally, and then also with our Japanese counterparts, and then just built that team and worked on some key efforts. So it's bring all that together.
How long were you there?
5 years altogether.
5 years. Wow. So I work with a lot of people from Japan here in the U.S. I worked at a company called Canon, and I had a lot of expats here in the U.S., and it was just a delightful experience trying to learn so much about them and the country from them being here in the U.S. I suspect it was very similar, being an expat there in Japan and living for 5 years, which is a pretty reasonable amount of time to get integrated into the local community.
It was. We still have some very strong friendships as my wife and I go back a couple times a year, and we'll visit our friends and our children who were also blessed to be able to be there with us.
Nice.
During that sort of pivotal middle school, high school, transition to college period. They likewise look back on it as a very formative period.
Did they learn the language as well?
Yes.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you, Stan, joining us and giving us that kind of an insight. I think just in speaking to you, you have such a unique perspective coming from Idaho, having this vision of being in the aerospace industry, maybe becoming an astronaut, and living out your dream in many ways, still being in the aerospace arena, or astronomical arena. So I appreciate you joining us.
Thank you, Ronnie. It's been a real pleasure to talk.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us on Business Decoded with Ronnie Spellman.
Thank you for listening to Business Decoded podcast with Ronnie Spellman. Please be sure to subscribe and share, and stay tuned for more incredible Business Decoded episodes.